Okay, I'm pretty sure we're live now. My name's Austin. This is episode 17 of the Fairgo Basic Income Discussion Group. These discussion groups usually feature a special guest, and today is no exception to that. We have Philippe Van Parijs. Am I saying that your last name right? Is that right, Philippe? Philippe Van Parijs?
I'm
Great.
very tolerant about that, but it would be better to say Van Parijs. It just means from,
is that?
that's right. It means from Paris in Dutch.
Oh, fantastic. He is one of, I would say, one of the founders of the modern basic income movement. In particular, I think one of his, what you could call a seminal essay in the basic income movement is his 1986, I think. The paper was The Capitalist Road to Communism, which was interesting because, you know, we've had, even before this in history, we've had liberals and even neoliberals like Milton Friedman advocate some kind of basic income-like policies. And this was one of the first times it was made from not just a leftist perspective, but quite a dogmatic Marxist perspective. I've read a recent article of yours, an interview you did in 2021, and there was still some reference to this Marxist literature. And I think so our topic today is basic income and the left, and what is the relationship between leftist politics and a basic income. So there's probably no one more used to speaking about this topic than you. I mean, I guess what strikes me, my first reaction is that you seem concerned in a lot of these, in a lot of your work, to argue that basic income is sort of compatible with a Marxist or communist outlook. Why is that even an interesting question? Is the first thing that comes to my mind. Is like, shouldn't we be asking whether it works for people first? Should we try and be post-ideological, or why is this dogmatic question interesting for me?
Okay, well, first of all, needs to qualify one of the things you said. I've personally never been a Marxist, and certainly that paper, which is the first article I published in English on basic income with my friend Robert van der Veen, so under the title "The Capitalist Road to Communism." This was not exactly an exercise in dogmatic Marxism. Indeed, we we offered the article for publication in the New Left Review, where I had published before, and I said this is really beyond the pale of what is acceptable for us and for a journal that was rather Marxist oriented. And the communism we are talking about there is the communism in a very specific sense, a sense which Marx in a way shared with his predecessors, the so-called utopian socialists, and that was communism defined as a society in which people would voluntarily contribute according to their capacities and receive or take from the social product according to their needs, free of charge. And so basic income was there sort of framed as a way of realizing this ideal, but without using socialism, that is, without using the collective ownership of the means of production as the way of getting there. Because Marx's argument for socialism, for the collective state ownership of the means of production, was not a social justice argument, but an efficiency argument. So I'm saying it would be the best way, turning from capitalism to socialism will be the way of getting rid of the fetters imposed by capitalism on the development of the force of production. And we need to reach a state of economic abundance for this ideal of communism, defined the way I just did, from each voluntarily according to his or her capacities, to each according to his or her needs, for this ideal to be realizable. And so that was the framing. Of course, it was in part tongue-in-cheek to call this a capitalist road to communism, but it's definitely left. I mean, certainly defended that as a view from the left, as something defensible from the left, even the radical left, but the non-Marxist left.
Fantastic. So we should be reading that title as a little bit of a provocative, tongue-in-cheek way of maybe having a crack at dogmatic leftism, rather than trying to, you know, imagine we're going to convert a bunch of hardcore Trotskyists to become basic income advocates. One thing that I remember, well, everyone, by the way, please remember to start putting your hands up as soon as you like, and we'll come to the questions in order that the hands go up. But when you mentioned, you know, the from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, I remember very much Mark Zuckerberg's Harvard commencement speech. He did a speech to the people at Harvard where he advocated a basic income, and he said something like, I'll paraphrase, but it's pretty close to this. He said something like, I was never worried, you know, about being in poverty. He had some privilege, and he goes, so I got to take a lot of shots, and we need to give everybody what they need so they can take a lot of shots, like in basketball, is this metaphor, and then we'll get, you know, that way everybody will be able to contribute to the best of their abilities. And so he said it in the other order, but I couldn't help it when I heard it. I'm like, that's the Communist Manifesto, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. And we're hearing that out of the mouth of one of the richest people in the world, right? This kind of post-hyper-capitalist billionaire, Mark Zuckerberg. And, you know, a lot of my friends on the left, they didn't even seem to think it was interesting that he was saying this. Even if he's lying or whatever, it's interesting that his lies sound so much like the Communist Manifesto. What's the awkwardness with the left and basic income? Why is there so much of this aversion? And I mean, I'll add one more thought. It seems almost like they don't know how to, they don't know how to win, right? The left says, like, we've convinced everybody and our morals are now mainstream, would be one response. But the left doesn't seem to say that. It seems to want to stay in the margins sometimes, right? What do you think about? I'm sorry, that's more of a comment than a question, but I'm sure you have plenty to say.
Yeah, in a way, it's more than one question. Also, it's several questions at the same time. So, well, first of all, also there is perhaps to make this idea of from each according to their capacities, to each according to their needs, to make it more concrete and connect it also to technological development. It's in fact, there is a realization of that ideal at the very core of cognitive capitalism, namely Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a sort of communist adventure, communist initiative, because people roughly, there are hardly any people compared to the number of contributors, hardly any people paid for their contribution to Wikipedia, and in fact, it's people contributing according to their competences and their share what they know there, and so it's a way of making more concrete this idea from each without needing to be paid according to their capacities, and then people also take from Wikipedia according to their needs. And so you can see that as a model of what basic income is trying to achieve, not just in that particular sector of the sharing of knowledge, but far more generally. And it does so by giving a part of what people are going to consume free of charge. And that's why basic income is unconditional in this sense. And at the same time, of course, the more you give that unconditionally, the less people are forced to work, and that means the more work is becoming voluntary, even though it, and especially, of course, the more thankless sort of jobs will still need to be paid, and some of these jobs more paid, better paid than now. But then to turn then to Zuckerberg, and indeed this striking passage in his commencement speech just a month after our book was big book on basic income was published by Harvard University Press. So then he said that the expression he used when he mentioned universal basic income is that he saw it as a cushion to try new ideas. And it was this, the underlying intuition is that if you give people enough for them to live on, this will enable people to risk trying new ideas. It will give them the freedom to try new ideas. And that is very important, not just in terms of equalizing opportunities, so that it wouldn't be only the children of rich people, people whose daddy and mommy give them a basic income, that would be able to to try really to realize their vocation, to try to realize what they've been wanting to do of their lives. It would be a way of democratizing this possibility. But at the same time, it's also a contribution to the development of the productive forces, because freedom itself is a productive force. It's what enables you to try new ideas and thereby to contribute to not only economic progress, but progress more generally. It's not only innovation in an economically rewarding sector, but also it can be innovation in the way in which about the way in which neighborhoods function, etc., etc. And you give this freedom, more freedom to the people. And so then but in your question, there was then also, so why is the left then reluctant, or part of the left reluctant to adopt something like the idea, or to see that there is something right in what people like Zuckerberg say? Well, it's of course part of the left is attracted by basic income, and the left is also is massive support by people who situate themselves on the left. But in the left, and to put it very, very simplistically, you could say there are two tendencies, and sort of in terms of the doctrinal basis. What defines the left broadly is the demand for more equality. But for some of them, some people on the left, the second central idea is the idea of work, defined as paid work, waged work. And then equality, the pursuit of equality must go in hand with giving work the value it deserves. And then there is another branch, as it were, another tendency within the left that says, well, we need to pursue equality, but without abandoning freedom to the right. Freedom, emancipation, liberation is a left-wing idea. And of course, for people who hold that view, basic income is a very attractive, I mean, it's impossible not to be interested in basic income if you are at the same time in favor of equality and in favor of freedom. And once you do that, well, then the sort of arguments presented by Zuckerberg become more relevant and cannot immediately, I mean, sort of straightforwardly be dismissed as being right-wing talk.
Stephen, you've got your hand up. Why don't you proceed with your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you.
Okay, I think the answer is the left is afraid of unemployment. They can't envision a society where there are more people that aren't in work. So they're scared of the scare campaign that's going to come from conservatives who push the lazy, and the wealth will just dry up because people aren't working or something. So the left, I think the left has to take that front on and say, we want to drive up unemployment, but in doing so, we get a basic income, so we'll actually be better off, and people will be able to fix things in their own communities. They won't have to wait for a job to show up to fix it, while we'll still have a large level of people in paid work. But it's just that fear that if unemployment goes up 3%, then the media says, oh, this is a complete failure. We need to go back to, what we were doing before. So I was just wondering what your opinion on like the embrace of full employment by left-wing political parties is?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's extremely important to distinguish two notions of full employment. There is one notion which must be rejected, which is both unfeasible and undesirable, which is the ideal of the sort of traditional male breadwinner ideal of full-time work for one's for the full length of one's adult life for all men and all women. That needs to be rejected. But what we must not reject is full employment in another sense, that all the people who would like to work in the sense of having a paid job should have the possibility of getting a paid job. And a basic income is not the substitution, or proposing a basic income doesn't amount to saying, well, given that we won't be able to provide a job to everyone, we'll just say that the people who can't get a job will get an income without being bothered. I don't defend that view. I think it's very important that all the people who want to get a job should get one. And that's important for a number of distinct reasons. Of course, it's for many people a way of getting out of their immediate surroundings for men and women, and to get into a network of people that's much larger than the one to which they would be confined if they didn't have such a job. Now, of course, it depends very much on the nature of the job, but for many people, it performs that function. It's a way for many people to feel that they are recognized by society. That is so now, but of course it's not the only way of getting this recognition, but for many people it's the easiest way or the most straightforward way. This is a second reason. It's a way for many people to develop some of the capacities they have, and therefore finding also some sort of fulfillment. And for many people it's also simply the way in which they can really contribute in a useful way to society. So for all these reasons, I don't think that defending an unconditional basic income must be seen as a rejection of the importance of paid work. It's a relativization of that, of the importance of paid work by saying, well, there are also all sorts of unpaid work, which some of which are far more important than many forms of paid work, but nevertheless, it's important to keep the objective of enabling all the people who want a paid job, a meaningful paid job, to have access to that job. And a basic income is a way of achieving that, because of its universal nature, the fact that it can be combined with income from other sources, in particular combined with precarious income, people who want to have an artistic life, but they don't know exactly how much they learn from one day to the next, people who have a job that will pay very little or nothing at all initially, because it involved a lot of training, a lot of acquisition of knowledge. These jobs must be more easily accessible. More of these jobs must exist, must be created because of the presence of a basic income. And basic income, in order to address the challenge which we'll face because of the climate, but because of technological change, automation, the basic income has as a natural complement lifelong learning, and in particular lifelong blended learning, with full use of what's available free of charge, or essentially free of charge thanks to the internet, with the critical creative appropriation at the local level in schools, but also in more informal contexts. And a basic income is a natural complement to that, because a basic income facilitates the back and forth between employment, education in the broader sense, and voluntary activities within the household and also outside of the household. And so that I fully agree with you that part of the hostility of part of the left in particular the part of the left that's closely linked to the trade unions and to the labor unions, that part of that much of that hostility is due to an excessive attachment to an obsolete ideal of full-time employment. But recognizing that must not make us poo-poo or dismiss the concerns of the people who say, well, you know, there are people around me who don't have a job and are desperate to get one. Well, we must create the possibilities, and basic income is one of the instruments for these people to have access to a job.
Fantastic. We're going to go to Michael in just a second. I just have a quick follow-up on that issue. So, you know, you're talking about people coming in and out of the workforce and, you know, breaking this idea of lifelong work up a little bit. One of our, someone that I'm sure you'll have had contact with, Alex Howlett from Boston Basic Income. He has a lovely phrase that I like. He says that if everybody is quitting their job, the basic income is too high. And if nobody is quitting their job, the basic income is too low. And it's this idea of that you've got to find that spot where it has the right effect in terms of the level. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that before we go to Michael's questions about how the level of basic income will sort of calibrate its effect on employment.
Well, basic income needs to be sustainable, and therefore, indeed, there can be levels of basic income which are too high because the reduction in the supply of labor will be such that you'll have to immediately lower the level of basic income. But at the same time, as you say, it's the fact that more people will go for part-time work, in particular, people who and that's also an important component of the rationale for a basic income. And so, for example, when there are basic income experiments that are being performed and that we discover that some people reduce their working time or interrupt their working career, should we say, oh, therefore basic income is a bad idea? No, it's part of the purpose. But it's very important that this impact also on the supply of labor should be differentiated. And so that's related to what I just said, so that when people ask, with the basic income will wages, more broadly the remuneration of work, will it go up or go down? Some people will say, obviously, it will go down because if part of people's needs are covered anyway, so the wage is just a top-up, which can be lower than it is now. And other people say, no, wages will go up because people having an unconditional basic income will give them more bargaining power. And so what's the right answer? The right answer is, it depends on the nature of the job. And so if the job is performed under dangerous conditions with a terrible commuting time, with an awful boss, with boring colleagues and whatever, then people will say, well, in order to keep doing this job, and you need to pay more, or you improve the quality of the job in one way or another. But there are some jobs today which are not possible, as self-employed people, launching a cooperative, some sort of partnership, a startup, which there are jobs that are not viable now, and that would be made viable precisely for the Zuckerberg reason which you mentioned before, because and the income you need will be a top-up on what you have. And so therefore, if it's a job that is promising, interesting, challenging, rewarding in itself, then more of these jobs will be created and be economically viable.
So we move the focus to intrinsic interest in the work and away from extrinsic coercive reasons to do work. That's how, exactly. As we increase the basic income, we move along. Hey, we've got a guest star.
This is, et tu vois, là-bas, il y a des arbres, mais il n'y a pas de kangourou. Il n'y a pas de kangourou.
Pourquoi?
Parce que là, il est dans sa chambre. Okay. Right. So, as I was explaining, he was hoping that he would see some kangaroos there, but okay.
Checking, not in the background. Michael, go ahead.
Philippe, very interesting discussion. Thank you. You've sort of answered the question that I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway to be specific. It does seem that the unions in particular on the left are anti-UBI because of the attack they perceive it makes on minimum wages and conditions. Is that a view that's generally understood, or is that just I'm mistaking it?
The connection, sorry, because piece of paper dropped, then I may have missed part of your question, but
Yes.
It's about the relationship between basic income and minimum wage.
Yeah, and the unions, how they feel about it as a result.
Yeah. So I think some people say, well, once you have a basic income, you no longer need minimum wage legislation. Well, this is not correct, and so you can have both at the same time. First, because minimum legislation also performs other functions than simply protecting low incomes. In particular, it's a way of fighting the black economy, because it means that anyone who is employed must be paid in a taxable way, at least the minimum wage for a full-time job. Of course, also basic income needs to be funded. And if you want to fund it with the personal income tax, then it means that you'll need to tax wages from the first dollar or the first euro, whatever that is being earned. So that, in fact, the gross wages, the pre-tax wages of the people with the lowest wages, and the pre-tax wage will not be able to be, it will not be possible to reduce it very much while maintaining the purchasing power of the household. So that means that there wouldn't be that much of a leeway to reduce the minimum wage in those countries in which there is already a minimum wage. So you can combine the basic income with the preservations of minimum wage. Then some people will say, yes, but what about then the alleged impact of a basic income on employment? The idea that more people will be able to find employment if there is a basic income, precisely because they only need a top-up. Yes, but of course, even if you have a minimum wage, you'll be able to develop employment thanks to self-employment and to part-time employment. It's mainly then part-time employment that will be made more viable than is currently the case. And of course, this part-time employment is also very important for the investment in human capital, so that people can spend some of their time acquiring further training, or also looking after the human capital of the younger generation by spending more time with their children at the time when their children need it.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Let's go to Jessica.
Hi, Philippe. Thank you so much for being here today. I've got a two-part question. As someone who maybe isn't as well versed at the moment on the political economy side of things and why there are hostilities in the left towards basic income, you started to talk about it, but I was wondering if you could just give like an introductory overview, just to set the scene of why is this an issue? Just what are the main sticking points for folks on the left? And then just question part two is also, in all your years of being an advocate, do you still have some of your own lingering concerns about issues of, let's say, a full UBI rollout that maybe you're personally still a little bit concerned about, or you're not so sure of? Hopefully those questions make sense.
Okay, two big questions. First, so the broad overview. And so the left, it's very clear, for example, in Europe, that the most the sort of consistently most hostile political family is the social democratic family, which in Europe is in general closely linked to the trade union movement. And the trade unions, at least the tops, certainly the tops of the trade unions, don't like this idea. Why not? Why not? Well, one reason is sort of ideological, you would say, and because of the centrality of work. If you are called a labor union, you see your main task as consisting in defending the interests, the privileges sometimes of the people who have in particular a stable job. And then given that they see that as the ideal, then the most broad-minded unions will find it very important to get this privilege shared by more people. And sometimes you have very sort of particularistic corporatist trade unions that only look after the interests of their own members, but sometimes you have very broad federations which then have a more sort of universalistic ideal of getting more people involved. And in some cases, like in my country, you have many unemployed people who are also members of the trade union. But there is the ideology, in a way, the idea that there cannot be a fulfilling life that is not in which wage labor is not central. You have that aspect, but you have also another aspect which shows in the fact that some trade unions are more favorable to a negative income tax than to a basic income. And why is that? Because a basic negative income tax is usually conceived practically always at the level of the household as a whole. And that means if you have a breadwinner, usually male in the family, and then another partner who doesn't work, doesn't do paid work at all, or only very little, when you have a negative income tax, then it takes the form of a tax credit for the breadwinner, which makes it look as if the wage was much higher than it would be if you had the same level of tax credit given as a basic income to each of the two partners. And so that there's this sort of optical illusion which the trade unions prefer, which then gives more importance to the part of a household's income that comes through the wage, and so therefore through the member of the trade union. That's a second. Just before I give you a third reason, I'll see what.
Je veux les éléphants.
Eh bien, je vais donner les éléphants. He couldn't get the kangaroos, but there are little elephants here, which attention, il ne faut pas les cacher. Okay. So that's certainly a second important reason. And then in some countries also you have, probably not in Australia, you have a significant part of the incomes of the trade unions, of their revenues, of the trade union itself, comes from the role they play in the distribution of unemployment benefits, that is, benefits for involuntary unemployment. Of course, if you have a reform that will reduce significantly involuntary unemployment, and both by sharing employment more widely and by transforming some involuntary unemployment to voluntary unemployment, then the trade unions say, oh, this is not a reform for us. But there are some trade unions, and particularly at the very beginning of the European debate on basic income in the 1980s, really the spearhead was a Dutch trade union of food workers, food sector workers, headed by a woman, with a majority of female workers as members and a majority of part-time workers. And they were very strongly in favor of basic income. In fact, they played a crucial role in launching the European debate of basic income in the early 1980s, were completely unaware of the negative income tax discussion 15 years earlier in the United States. And so that, and in the attitude of the social democratic left, and therefore linked to the trade unions, you certainly have these various components that are present to different extents in different countries. But perhaps one way then of getting to what's central in it is related to the very beginning of our conversation. And so people on the left have in common that they find capitalist exploitation unacceptable. It needs to be abolished or at least reduced. But the reason, and turned out what the basic income discussion reveals, is that the reason for finding capitalist exploitation unacceptable differs fundamentally. Some people find it unacceptable because some people are forced to sell their labor power to a capitalist. And of course, for them, basic income is fantastic because it gives bargaining power to everyone, which otherwise is restricted to the people who own capital or who own very valuable human capital. So basic income is fantastic for them. But other people are opposed to capitalist exploitation because it enables some people to live and to live well without working. And for them, of course, basic income is scandalous because it would give to everyone this possibility, which fortunately, under present circumstances, is only limited to the minority of capitalists. And of course, on this second view, the second view relies on some, in my view, absurd ideal of wage labor as being something that's essential to a good life.
Does it depend on the idea that wage labor is part of a good life, or is that cover for the fact that they can only see victims as virtuous? So, you know, you said before that it's not about doing stuff, it's about doing stuff under the institution of employment, which is a state of exploitation. So the only way to be a good person is to be one of the exploited rather than to be the exploiter. And they don't want to de-escalate that conflict because then there won't be anyone to gnash their teeth at. I mean, is that that simple?
There's something like that, but I think that's a bit uncharitable to them. I mean, to be fair to them, of course, at the same time, it's not as if they would like to maximize exploitation in order to be more of a victim. They want to reduce exploitation, but I find indeed, because wage labor is so central, what they want is above all than to better protect that status, to increase their wages, to increase the share of wages in value added at the expense of profits, etc. So it's not as if they wanted to be as much of an exploited victim as possible.
Emma.
So I've noticed a little bit of a wariness on the left in my experience that I guess, you know, there's so many societal issues that have come about because we have this capitalistic market-based society. And I think that there is a wariness to adopt a market-based solution to that. I feel like sometimes that's exacerbated by the fact that it's supported by billionaires as an idea. And I think, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about recommendations or something to potentially like combat this notion that we should be fighting against capitalism and a market-based society, like as the way we live, rather than finding a solution within that society. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's also part of the reluctance on some parts of the left. Some people find that not only capitalism, but the market itself, that there is something wicked about the market itself. And I think the view that will turn out to appear as reasonable to everyone once you do a little bit of reflection is that we absolutely need the market. The market well used and of course well framed and well regulated is of course a fantastic tool in order to coordinate our very complex now global and irreversibly global economies. So you need the market in order to sort of to incorporate in the price, in the structure of prices, at the same time all these massive bits of information on the supply side and how costly it is in terms of labor and other resources to produce a certain good, a particular good or a particular service, and at the same time also incorporate in that price all the very complex aspects of the demand for that good, whether direct or extremely indirect. And so the price mechanism is something extremely valuable, and the attempt to get rid of it in the Soviet regimes led to a catastrophe, which doesn't mean that we need more market than is currently the case. We need better markets, and we need, of course, regulation of that market in all sorts of ways to protect our environment, to protect the interests of future generations, to prevent, including great innovators, to misuse the monopoly power they acquire. So we need all this, and so the left needs to have. It's important for the left to have a more relaxed attitude towards the market, which it largely has. Frankly, we sometimes it has it a bit too much. Some of the third way, a la Blair and or Schröder in Germany, were a bit going a bit too much that way. So it's important to find the right balance, and importance at the same time also to see that the right balance to find is not only between the state and the market, but between the state, the market, and what some of the inspirers of the idea of basic income and of the ecological movement called the autonomous sphere. André Gorz called it the autonomous sphere. So this idea that also a lot of even the economic production activity happens neither within the market sphere nor within the state sphere, but now in what is now very often called also the commons, which is part of neither of these traditional two big spheres, and but in a way part of the most traditional of all spheres, which is then the householding part, or the local communities, or the global communities like Wikipedia. That's also part of it. And so we need, and so the left needs more than it does today to see that and the left cannot be reduced to a fight for more state and for more civil servants at the expense of the market. I haven't forgotten this, Jessica's second question, to which we can return, which is a difficult question, but I see that. Yeah.
Let's hear your response. Do you have any lingering concerns about problems that would come from a basic income? Just to remind people what the question was.
And the question is certainly yes. I'll mention three. One is related to the philosophical justification of basic income. And so the philosophical justification, which I first developed in that lecture I gave at Harvard in 1990 and was published under the title "Why Surfers Should Be Fed," and I later developed in my book "Real Freedom for All." And the basic intuition is that, in fact, what a basic income does is not take part of the fruits of the labor of some of the current workers in order to give it to all, including some people who may choose not to do anything, not to contribute anything to the social product. But what a basic income does is, in fact, share among all part of what we all receive very unequally, and in most cases, or mostly incorporated into the rewards we get for our work. And so most of our wages, the remuneration of our work is not something that's due to our own efforts, but it's due to the privilege of having been born where we've been born, at the time we've been born, so taking advantage of all these technological advances, of all this capital accumulation, of all these institutional organizations for which we have strictly no merit. And most of our income is due to that. And what the basic income does is take part of that and distribute it equally to all. And on the whole, I think that's a sound justification, but I need somehow to reconcile it with an intuition which I share, I think, with practically everyone, probably all of you, which is that really a good life and a good society must make room for this something like a duty to do things for other people than yourself, and that there can't be a good life without something like that. Of course, it doesn't need to take the form of wage work, and there can't be a good society that doesn't rely on this moral obligation felt by all to do something for others, be useful to others. And so there is some sort of tension between this conception of justice, where you say, well, giving it unconditionally is perfectly fine. It's just something we've all received, and we distribute it more equally. So that's one concern. Then a second objection, which I found interesting, it's the most original objection, which I recently discovered, thanks to a law professor at Columbia University in New York. And what she said, well, you know, what basic income does is in a way make firms, enterprises, function more and be more like associations. Why? Because associations are sort of organizations in a broad sense that you join for other reasons than the money you are going to earn there. And as a result of that, in fact, associations are pretty homogeneous, ethnically speaking, culturally speaking, because you join associations with other people who are like you. They may have a different color of skin, or they may differ in many respects, but they are similar to you. And so, and in fact, when you look at it in the United States, she said, well, associations, including churches, etc., are far more homogeneous, less diverse, less ethnically diverse than enterprise. An enterprise, well, it's in the interest of the boss to recruit the best workers, and it's in the interest of people to stick it out in the firm, because that's where they get their money from. So they're going to put up with people who are very different from themselves. And so here the argument is the higher the basic income, and the more choosy you'll be in the sort of firm you are going to join. And therefore the function that firms play in our complex societies in Sydney, in New York, in Brussels, in mixing people together, and these hyper diverse cities, mixing them together, this function will be reduced. I'm not saying it's a fatal objection to basic income, but it's an interesting objection to basic income, and of which I had never thought before. And then the third issue, it's maybe the most delicate in practical terms, is really migration. And migration, both immigration and emigration. And immigration is clear enough. So if you have a generous basic income somewhere, unconditional, so unrelated to social security contributions paid before, it's an attractor for potential beneficiaries. And so you can't really have a generous basic income in a country without having protection of your borders that is at least as strong as it currently is, may possibly be stronger. And this is never nice, because there can never be a fundamental ethical justification for keeping people away from the privileges we give to our own people. Of course, even if there is no basic income, there's a massive privilege that's incorporated in the level of the incomes of the people in our richer countries compared to other parts of the world. But this would certainly be a constant problem, and the sort of distinction we make in Europe, because we have free movement among the 27 countries, and with very great difference in average income, large difference in average income between countries. Then we say, well, if you don't have an income of your own, you can only stay for a limited period, but this would be far more difficult to implement if you had a basic income. But it's not only a question of immigration, so also a question of emigration, because basic income would be related to residence. But who is a resident? Are you still a resident if you go on holiday for 3 weeks? Yes, for 3 months, for 3 years. And who is going to check whether you are away and when? So that for a basic income, in my view, it must not be a matter of citizenship, it must be a matter of fiscal residence in a particular country. But how are you going to check that? So it's not only a question of not too many people entering so as to make the system unsustainable, but also it's also a matter of checking who can actually be regarded as a resident, and so what sort of control can you establish? And so these are some, I'm not saying that any of these three concerns of very different sorts of fatal to the idea. I don't think they are fatal, but they're not easy to address.
We're going to go to Stephen in just a second, but before we do that, I'm going to speak briefly about the third thing you mentioned, which is the migration issue. At the Bien conference in September, which I understand you'll be attending, I'm going to be presenting a paper called Global Social Liberalism. And one of the things I advocate in that is for a global basic income. And one of the arguments I make is that whatever we think about immigration policies in the West, and whether we want to have bigger fences to keep out economically motivated migrants, we should all object to compelled migration, which is the reality of the situation now, that people are forced by poverty to migrate. And we can all agree, everyone from the most xenophobic to the most open-minded people can agree, it would be nice if people didn't have to move, right? So we can also imagine a global basic income as happening, almost even, I would imagine, it should happen first. Because if you did the global basic income first, you could demilitarize borders, and you could relax this crucial social issue, which is so divisive, and you could do it in a positive way. So I'll be presenting that in September in Brisbane. Will you be joining us in September?
Yes, but online. I won't be traveling to Brisbane. Yeah, okay. But I agreed to give one of the keynotes. Yes, I mean, it's of course in our book on basic income we have a the Harvard book published in 2017. The final chapter is partly devoted to it's about the challenge of globalization, and particularly then we discuss the idea of a global basic income, and of course and we discuss the idea then of a EU-wide, European Union-wide basic income as sort of experiment in that direction, using as one of the arguments in favor of that, which in the medium term is more realistic than the worldwide basic income, but using as one of the arguments precisely the argument you use, which is the argument of demographic stabilization, as it were, so that the people would not be forced by poverty to migrate. So it would be possible for people to stay in Romania, in Bulgaria, rather than flock into the more affluent cities of Europe. And so that would be better on both sides. And I mentioned there that I had a conversation with the president of Brazil before Lula, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who I went to see with Eduardo Suplicy, who is one of the great defenders of basic income in Brazil. So that was in 1990s. in order to try to convince him to introduce at the, or to co-fund at the federal level the minimum income schemes that had started being introduced in some municipalities in Brazil. And part of the argument that then had convinced him to do that, and that led to the current Bolsa Familia system, which is means tested, but nevertheless a form of sort of pioneering form of income support in less developed countries. But one of the arguments that key argument that convinced him was precisely that it would enable the people in the Nordeste, the poor Nordeste of Brazil, to stay in their municipalities rather than flock into overcrowded favelas in Sao Paulo or in Rio de Janeiro. And so that argument is very important, and it's important worldwide. I share your view that for the long term, it's impossible to think about a just world without a systematic, sort of recurrent and irreversible, so totally permanent redistribution of income from the richer parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world. And that needs to be done in a way that doesn't create a poverty trap, and therefore it must take the form of a floor of income, like a basic income. So I fully share that view. The question is, how do we get there? But without that, we'll have, especially in Europe, where we are so close, Australia, you are further away from the sources of the main sources of pressure, but we will have hundreds of millions of people trying to cross, being forced to try to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And if you want to avoid that, you'll have to have something like a worldwide basic income, certainly, and to be gradually introduced, etc. And so thinking in the longer term, out of the box, is absolutely essential. So I'm on your line then.
Okay, great. Look, I'm going to apologize to Michael, who's just put his hand up. We're not going to have time to get to your question. We're going to have, Stephen's going to have the last question, and then after Philippe responds to Stephen's question, we've got a short message from Jessica that we'll take, and then we'll wrap up. And I promised Philippe he could get away after 1 hour rather than the usual 90 minutes. Where marathon talk is here, but we'll let you get on with your day. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a quick question. So if the left does not embrace a basic income, then what else can it do? Like, it doesn't seem like there's another big idea out there. So what do you think?
Yes, well, we shouldn't give up the hope that the left, of course, parts of the left does embrace basic income, but I can't say that it's a majority on the left. But it's making progress. Huh? So for the first time, for example, the German Greens, who are now in the government, at the Congress before the latest general election, for the first time, they put basic income, an unconditional basic income, in their program. So it's making some progress, but at different paces in different countries. One of the candidates for the French presidency, the candidate for the Socialist Party 5 years ago, put basic income, unconditional basic income, as a central proposal in his program. So it does make progress, but sometimes there is also regression. Sometimes, so it's a slow process. But then what would be the alternative? For example, we have here in Belgium, we have a very bright chair of the Socialist Party, one called Paul Magnet, who is also an academic political scientist. And so he was sort of attracted by the idea of basic income. But then in the draft of a book, which he's going to publish soon, and which he asked me to comment on, then in the end, he indicates that he can see the point of a basic income, then comes out in favor of some sort of guaranteed employment, so that everyone who would like to work,
sorry, I vomit every time I hear about the job guarantee idea. I can't help it. It's a physical response. I just vomit. Yeah, sorry.
That's because you are part of the freedom-loving rather than labor-loving left, and it is, as I am, and I explained that to him too, and I emphasize the fact in my comment that it was very important for socialists not to let the liberals get away with saying we have the monopoly of freedom. And there are all sorts of efficiency arguments. Also, we discussed that in chapter 2 of our book against the employment guarantee. But it has some plausibility, of course, and that needs to be addressed. It will be part of my keynote also for Brisbane, and which is that, in fact, given the climate change, given the pandemic and the healthcare issues, there's a lot of work needed in these in some important jobs, and the intuition behind it is that rather than waste this money by giving it away, let's target it in those activities that are meaningful in themselves and really essential and urgent in order to secure, in particular, the ecological transition we need. And so that answer the question was not whether I thought these alternative ideas were good ideas, but certainly this is something that has traction in parts of the left, because it's a way of recognizing that the market on its own, the way it functions now, will not give, especially if you have minimum wages, etc., will not give a job, a livable job to everyone. So you need additional action. But people more statist, more laborist, the more statist, more laborist left will say, well, we know how to do it and we'll create those jobs, because there are good reasons for thinking that this is not the way to go, both of a very down-to-earth pragmatic sort and of a more philosophical sort. That is, and these reasons of a philosophical sort is that, please, the left must not abandon the idea that it wants to free people, to give people freedom. And you cannot say, and that's a bit of an uncharitable accusation, not just repeat the slogan that was at the entrance of the concentration camps during the war, which was Arbeit macht frei, and so work will free. There's, of course, some work helps free people, but it's not work, and certainly not wage work in itself, that can liberate people, whether men or women.
Fantastic. Now, so that's why we're all members here of Basic Income Australia. Well, maybe not everyone on the call, but a lot of us are. A very dynamic member of that group is Jessica, and she's got a quick message for us.
Yes, very quickly. So I'm on the local organising committee for the Congress, so working with Greg and Elise and Troy, just to say we're really excited to have you later on in September online. And just in case anyone's on the call and they don't know, there is going to be the Basic Income Earth Network Congress in Brisbane, and also hybrid from September 26th to 28th. Registrations are open, so please come along. And thank you so much, Philippe.
And Michael, who's on the call as well, whose question got cancelled, will also be speaking, presenting the Basic Income Australia proposal called the Fair Go Payment, like our Fair Go discussion group. So I hope that Philippe and everybody else will check that out as well in September. Philippe, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you to you, and good luck to Basic Income Australia. Bye.
Thank you, Philippe.
Bye-bye.
Very good. Thank you.